What's up, people of the internet? My name is Dabicab, and today we're going to talk about deck archetypes, specifically which color is best at which archetype. So if you want to know what you can expect from each color, stay tuned. Okay, so what is a deck archetype? A deck archetype is essentially a style of deck. People use deck archetypes to explain what a deck does and maybe how it does it, because even though two different decks can have completely different cards, they might share no cards in common. Nonetheless, they might try to win in very similar ways. For example, the first deck archetype we'll go over today is Aggro. Aggro decks are fast, cheap, and inexpensive. They throw down lots of high attack, low health minions. It's all offense, no defense. The hope is that they overwhelm the opponent with cheap, efficient cards and completely destroy them before the enemy deck has an opportunity to come online. Now at PAX, one of the decks was an aggro deck. It was called Blue-Black Aggro. So you might be thinking, well, of course, then blue and black are the two aggro colors. And while I would certainly say that black is aggro, I would not say that blue is aggro. In fact, I would say that this deck is more of kind of a combo deck, which we can go into later. I would say the two biggest aggro colors are actually black and red. Black likes cheap burn spells, things like Grazing Shot or Gank. It's all about throwing out damage where you need it on the battlefield so you can push through and deal damage to the tower. Also, black has some really powerful, really aggressive heroes like Sorla Khan, Phantom Assassin, that's all about getting those kills, taking out enemy cards so that you can empty out a lane and destroy the enemy tower. Aggro decks will probably be the best decks at going single lane. That is absolutely the case for the blue-black aggro deck that we saw at PAX. The only time I ever saw a deck go single lane and take out the ancient was the blue-black aggro deck, and in fact, they do quite an impressive job of it. Green might be able to pull off aggro, but if they can, then my guess is they're going to be a special type of aggro deck, which I'll go into later. Blue, blue's not really going to be an aggro color. Yes, of course, I know about the blue-black PAX aggro deck, sure, but as I said, that's more of a combo deck. Blue itself is a very slow color, so it likes to take its time, and time is the enemy of aggro decks. The longer the game goes on, the less likely an aggro deck will win. Because one of the weaknesses of the aggro deck is because you got to put out so many cheap cards. If you make it to the late game when people have 8, 9, 10 mana, and you draw 2 cards and they both cost 2, you put down 2 of your cards, they cost 4 mana total. Meanwhile, the opponent draws cards that cost 5 and 7, incredibly powerful cards, and he just wipes the board with you because he completely outvalues you. Your opponent is more than likely going to have more powerful cards. The trick is killing him before he gets to play those cards. Red is also quite good at aggro, but in a very different way from black. They're less about being really aggressive and more about just controlling the battlefield early on, especially with their massive heroes. On turn 1, red is basically the strongest color, simply by virtue of the fact that their heroes are the biggest. And because you get heroes out on the board for free, that means basically that they start the match with their best foot forward. And as the game goes on, you acquire items, and that will start to equalize things a little bit, because while it's true that red heroes are stronger than every other colored hero, once the other colored heroes start getting, swords and shields and armor, then they're going to start competing with the red heroes. So the red game plan is to take out enemy creeps, take out enemy heroes very early on, get a gold advantage, and then snowball with very powerful items that make your heroes even stronger. The trick is when you invest so heavily in heroes, you've only got 5 heroes, you can kind of run into situations late game where they just can't do enough, especially once the opponent gets a very wide board or throws out kill spells that takes out your heroes. So really, red is strongest early, and then the further the game goes on, they're going to get a little bit weaker every turn. All right, at the opposite end of the spectrum from aggro decks are control decks. Control decks are extremely weak in the early game. What they want to do is slow down the fight as much as possible, stop damage, prevent things from happening, because their game plan is to stall. What they want to do is get to the late game, because control decks tend to have powerful, expensive, game-winning cards that you can only play once you get to the late game. So the control game plan is to block damage, put down tough creatures that don't have a lot of attack, and they tend to have a lot of AoE because they have weak board presences. They like to just throw out massive amounts of damage to the board in the form of spells, and then wipe the board so that everyone has to start over from scratch. Then, once they get to the late game, they cast spells like Thunder God's Wrath, Eclipse, Echo Slam. Do any of these cards have something in common? Yes, they are all blue. That's because blue is very clearly the control color. They have slow, heavy, hard-hitting spells. The trick is their heroes are insanely weak, so they're just not going to be good at making it to the late game. Black also has a bit of control. They don't control in the same way as blue. They're more about targeted damage. They like to focus down one card and get it off the battlefield, either by burning it down with cards like Pick Off or No Accident, or by simply wiping it out with cards like Gank or Coup de Grace. So moving on to the next archetype, we have Midrange. Midrange is kind of like, well, the middle in between aggro and control. It's slower than aggro, which means it has more efficient cards, but it's faster than control, meaning it actually has a presence in the early and the mid game. Basically, the mid-range game plan is all about value and efficiency. It wants to have the best, strongest 1-cost card. Then it wants to have the best and strongest 2-cost card. The best and strongest 3-cost card, moving all the way up until, cost 6 or 7. At that point, if the game lasts until mana 6 or 7, then the mid-range decks start to fall off and be less powerful than the control deck. So the idea basically with the mid-range deck is that if you're playing with aggro, you use your more efficient cards to stop damage and control the board enough to win in the mid game. And against control decks, sure, it's not as fast as aggro, but the idea is it's still much faster than control, and it doesn't peter off quite as quickly as aggro decks do, so it can still somewhat compete with control decks in the late game. Mid-range decks like card draw, mid-range decks like tough creatures that survive combat because they want to get the most value. They like 2-for-1s. If you're not familiar with that term, that means you play 1 card and you kill 2 enemy cards with it. Red and black can be decent in the mid-range, but the true mid-range color is green. Green likes to put out strong, tough, durable creatures that can still pack a punch. So you put down something like a Savage Wolf. The Savage Wolf can trade with 2 or 3 units and still survive because he keeps getting stronger and healing every single turn. So this card kind of epitomizes the green mid-range flavor. You play 1 card, you do 2-for-1s, maybe 3-for-1s, and eventually just overwhelm your opponent with a very wide board. Plus, green likes survivability. It's kind of a tough color. It's got cards like Divine Purpose or Hand of God, because after all, once you've developed a very wide board, you want to keep it alive as much as possible. So if you're going mid-range, I would definitely consider adding green to your deck. Speaking of green, we'll talk very briefly about zoo decks. Zoo decks are kind of a special type of aggro. It's all about completely overwhelming your opponent with just a bajillion minions. Think of a zoo deck like a swarm of bees. No matter what you do, there are just too many creep for you to deal with, and they just completely roll over you. I'm expecting green to be the premier zoo color. Each of the other colors might be able to support green in the zoo role a bit, especially blue. From what we've seen at PAX, blue really likes to spawn basic melee creep, things like Dimensional Portal, Barracks, or better late than ever. And the neat thing about all 3 of these cards is that they're cross lane. So that flexibility allows blue to focus all of their creep in just 1 lane and basically dedicate 3 towers mana towards 1 lane's worth of offense. The problem is that they're all melee creep. So no matter how many melee creep you put in, at the end of the day, they're just 2 4s. So you kind of need some other way to seal the deal, unless we're underestimating blue's ability to completely swarm the opponent with melee creep. But that's to be determined. And last but not least, we have combo decks. Combo decks are about combining multiple cards to create a very powerful effect that each of the cards individually couldn't even hope to achieve on their own. The best example we know of is Dimensional Portal plus Disciple of Nevermore. 2 cards that when you play in the same lane creates a massive swing that can very quickly overwhelm your opponent. Now, my suspicion is that just about any color can pull off combos, because combos are less about a color and more about just 2 random cards interacting in a unique way. That being said, I think that almost all combo decks are going to tend to have blue in them, either as a core color or as a splash. Now, why is that? Well, one of the things that combo decks need to do is they need to draw their combo. If you need 3 different cards to pull up your crazy game-ending combo, then you have to actually draw them. that requires card draw, that requires slowing the game down to give you a chance to draw those cards. And that's what blue wants to do. Blue likes slowing the game down, and they like card draw with things like Foresight or with Jamoy's active ability. Plus you have interesting effects like Crystal Maiden's passive. Crystal Maiden isn't very powerful on her own, but I think she's going to be the go-to hero in combo decks because her passive gives you that 2 mana refund, which helps you chaining multiple spells, multiple cards in the same lane at the same turn. So blue in general will work very well with combo decks, but what that combo will actually be is going to kind of depend on the colors, it's going to kind of depend on the sets, and it's going to boil down to like what 2 random cards work together. It might be one red card, one green card. So do you make a red-green deck and make that a combo deck, or do you make a red-green deck and then splash in blue to help with the combo? I don't know, they're probably going to be the strangest decks in Artifact, especially because combo decks in Artifact work quite differently from in other card games. In Hearthstone, when it's your turn, it's your turn. You can do whatever you want, throw out as many cards as you want, and your opponent can't do anything about it. But in Artifact, when you play a card, unless it's a get initiative card, then priority passes to your opponent and then they get a chance to respond. So it might be a little bit difficult to play 3 cards in quick succession because every time you play a card, you're going to be interrupted. So I'm very interested to see how Artifact combo decks are going to work, how effective they're going to be, because you're just not going to be able to dump your whole hand before your opponent can do anything about it. For better or worse, personally, I really like that. I think that is a strength of the game because interactivity is a good thing. Being able to respond to your opponent is a good thing. A situation where you don't just sit there and watch an opponent play cards for like 10 turns, pulling off some insane combo. I play this, which lets me play that, which gives me mana to play these. And because of all these, that gives me another card, which lets me play this. Those are neat effects when you're doing it, when you're the one playing all those cards, but sitting there, twiddling your thumbs, waiting for the other guy to finish his 5-minute turn can be kind of boring. So I'm really looking forward to combo decks and Artifact. I want to see if they're viable, but you know, should be interesting. Should be interesting. So anyways, that's my breakdown of deck archetypes by color. If you disagree with me, let me know why down in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you so much for watching. Dabacab out.